People of the Secret. Chapter 12. Science Fiction. We began at the present time, then plunged back to the conjectured beginnings of the world. We have since flicked through the pages of the human story at random and have arrived back again at our own time. Does the life process seem like the result of random forces? Or does it suggest the unfolding of a vast and solemn plan? The verdict, in the last resort, must be an emotional one. No mustering of selected historical incidents, no suggested sequence, no interrelatedness can prove the existence of a noumenal level. At best, we can see flecks of foam on the surface and suspect the existence of a wave system underneath. Of its very nature, this must be invisible. But if there is some great plan for man and the world, with solar and cosmic goals set against millions of years, and if our present state is one stage in such a plan, then certain considerations arise which must be squarely faced. We are accustomed to regard the democratic forms of the 20th century as advances on earlier social forms, though Plato would not have agreed. If we do, we have to admit that they were bought at a price. Modern democracies were born out of the French Revolution. This and the so far unstabilized upheavals to which it gave rise manifestly involved fear, suffering, and death for millions. Does the end justify the means? Can an intelligence which employs such means be good in any sense we can entertain? Concurrently, the developing skills of science have freed millions from a grim survival-level existence and provided material rewards on a prodigious scale for millions more. But with its gifts, science has presented a bill. We must pay for our toys with stress and fear and the surrender of ancient and revered human values. If this has been arranged, can the intelligence which arranged it be benign? It seems that any theory of intervention must stand accused by human standards. We feel that suffering is regrettable enough when it is the consequence of chance and hazard. If it is purposive and deliberate, we can only regard it as intolerable. The answer, if there is one, must lie in the idea of scale. Let us assume that we as humans have some ordinary aim to achieve this day. By any standards we are able to apply, this aim is right and good. To discharge it, we must, let us say, catch a certain bus. The bus is starting away and is already accelerating, and only by a strenuous sprint can we hope to catch it. Our decision to make the effort triggers off a whole sequence of bodily events. Extra adrenaline pours into our blood. Our muscles contract in exceptional effort. By our deliberate action, we destroy millions of body cells. Each of these cells is a little life. They die. In a real sense, they are sacrificed to our aim. Do we feel compassion? Can we truly say that we experience remorse for their destruction from an action we took? Here there is a factor of scale which is all-important. Everything in the universe may be significant, but everything is not equally significant. Whether such a concept squares with our subjective ideas of good and higher is immaterial. This is how things are. Like Carlyle's correspondent, we have to accept the universe. We seldom notice that our capacity for compassion is a gradient. We can have no more than theoretical concern for the fate of the yeast we use to bake bread. Yet it is life. We feel minimal responsibility for cold-blooded life, increasing concern for warm-blooded life, and maximum concern for human life. For cellular life, we cannot feel at all. The gulf of scale is too great. It is beyond our limit. This limitation of scale is connected with time, with the maximum and minimum of the present moment, which our consciousness is able to span. A time-scale gap closer to everyday experience may illustrate. Suppose a young child has a thorn deeply embedded in a finger. The mother sees the situation in terms of a present moment vastly greater than the child's. She sees her baby's life as a whole, its well-being, growth, maturity. She takes a needle, digs it under the thorn, and removes it. The child's present moment is restricted to the 3 or 4 seconds during which a needle is piercing its flesh. In terms of the child's present moment, the mother is committing an incomprehensible act of cruelty, a deliberate infliction of needless suffering. The child does not understand, and cannot, that the mother's action arises from concern for its own ultimate good. To appreciate this, the child would need access to a present moment which it does not possess, and, at its stage of development, cannot possess. Also, the thorn must be the consequence of some action by the child itself, however helpless it may have been to avoid it. By analogy, the reign of terror and 2 world wars may represent no more than instantaneous needle jabs within a consciousness whose present moment is 10,000 years. If the whole of humanity is an organism on another timescale, its ultimate good may require action by an intelligence possessing an enormously greater present moment. To the individual man, whose present moment at maximum is his own lifetime, such action can suggest only indifference at best, and at worst, deliberate cruelty. If his present moment could be greatly extended, and if, from this viewpoint, he could see some sort of ego continuity outside a single life, his relationship to fate would be wholly transformed. But such considerations seem remote and impersonal. Pressures on elementary life forms to produce mankind, even vastly more recently, the manipulation of religious or cult impulses to create environmental opportunities for vast populations. Such things are remote from our immediate experience. If influences to coax or restrain human development along preordained lines play on human life, they should be detectable in some shadowy form in our own day and experience. The team, which made contact with a number of Sufi sources, concluded that telepathy was employed not only as an inter-Sufi communication system, but as a means of influencing people and things. If such an influence exists, it clears many coincidences, which prove intractable to ordinary explanation. There are many examples of inventions, individually improbable, being arrived at simultaneously by different people. Writers sometimes find themselves impelled to write extraordinary fantasy, which is later found to be prophetic. Dante, in The Divine Comedy, gives an exact description of the Southern Cross, a constellation which is invisible in the Northern Hemisphere, and which no traveller in those days could ever have seen. Swift, in The Journey to Laputa, gives the distances and periods of rotation of the 2 satellites of Mars, unknown at that time. When the American astronomer Asaph Hall discovered them in 1877 and noticed that his calculations corresponded to Swift's indications, he was seized with a sort of panic and named them Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror. In 1896, an English author, M.P. Shiel, published a short story in which we read of a band of monstrous criminals ravaging Europe, slaughtering families which they considered were impeding the progress of humanity and burning their corpses. The story was entitled The SS. On November 21, 1959, Sidney Jordan, the author of the script of the Jeff Hawke science fiction cartoon strip in the London Daily Express, had his sci-fi characters land on the moon and plant a plaque to mark man's conquest of a new planet. The date engraved on the plaque was August 4, 1969. Jordan thus predicted the actual event to within a fortnight, 10 years in advance. A London editor dealing with fictional manuscripts is often astonished to find that writers, sometimes on opposite sides of the world, seem for some unexplained reason to hit on identical plots for their stories at the same time. In one week in 1969, he reported reading 9 Stones with virtually the same plot. This plot had not previously turned up in his editing experience. If, as suggested, telepathy is one means by which human activity is incited or inhibited, it is conceivable that spin-off from such energies may cause trends of thinking of this sort at mundane level. It may also be that coming events are deliberately foreshadowed to prepare a mental climate for the event that lies on a line of probable actualization. There are reasons to suppose that almost the whole of science fiction belongs to this category. Space travel and atomic energy came as only minimal surprises to world populations which were barely emerging from the steam age. Verne and Wells and a whole host of later writers like Asimov and Clarke envisaged coming developments of science so concretely that they were able to present their fantasies as virtual realities. Thus, the ideas became acceptable mental currency in advance of their actualization. The idea of altering human behavior by the deliberate manipulation of environment is one with no apparent ancestry. Barely discernible traces of it are to be found in esoteric literature. Suddenly, from nowhere, it becomes a familiar everyday idea. It would be hard to imagine a subject less likely to appeal to a mass television audience, yet Patrick McGowan's The Prisoner was built on this idea and with the suggestion that a level existed, above which people were immune to this manipulation. T.S. Eliot's Cocktail Party and Cards of Identity by Nigel Dennis elaborate the same theme. Why did a most detailed extension of the same arcane idea occur to John Fowles, whose Magus captured popular interest to an extent unprecedented in any comparably difficult field? In the Magus, quite explicit, was the idea of a group of people possessing a different kind of knowledge, which enabled them, and apparently entitled them, to manipulate the psychology of selected ordinary men and women. Those so affected felt themselves to be the victims of some intolerable persecution, which, however, held for them an irresistible seduction and nostalgia. Only after they had been processed through suffering to rebellion and then to resignation did they begin to glimpse the catharsis through which they had been steered and the new level of life to which their experience entitled them. At the present time, dolphins have suddenly achieved worldwide interest. Scientists are investigating their intelligence. Documentary films are made about them. Factual and fictional writings about them appear almost every week. The idea that dolphins are in some way special seems to have been written into mythology thousands of years ago. Dolphins have been available for study ever since. There have been many cultures capable of studying them, yet only in the late 1960s do dolphins suddenly, unaccountably, become important. Suppose man's future is to involve him in meeting, somewhere in the universe, with life of approximately his own level but in unfamiliar forms. Such an encounter could be rehearsed exactly in the experience of those who at present are trying to communicate with dolphins. Did Rossum's universal robots and Metropolis prepare the last generation for our own generation's encounter with the computer? Seen from the present moment of the generation born before 1920, today's permissive society and the LSD and marijuana scene appear to be only deterioration, a fall from higher standards already reached. But just as the wresting of democracy from authoritarian kingship, a process seemingly entropic at the time, may have been the minimal basis on which a present and future situation could be based, so the actual experience that extrasensory states exist may be the foundation for a future which contains extrasensory experience as a widespread attribute. Any attempt to assess the permissive scene may also be complicated by a factor which is quite unsuspected. The suggestion of the deliberate creation of degeneracy in the youth of the West as the aim of a magical operation of revenge set in motion around 1920 and only now being executed. But if the future reaches back to the past to prepare us, it may also use the same means to warn. An example of this may be a recent science fiction story by Walter M. Miller, A Canticle for Leibowitz. Here the concepts show such remarkable insight into actual mechanisms that it is to be conjectured either that the author is a remarkably sensitive receiver or else has structured his insights on the basis of knowledge from a genuine source. Nuclear warfare has destroyed civilization, but an electronics engineer called Leibowitz, who foresaw the disaster, had founded a monastery, with church permission, in a remote desert in America. During the immediate post-war period, the masses had slaughtered such of the surviving scientists as had not gained sanctuary in the church. In the dark ages that follow, the real events of recent history become distorted and turned into myths. The nuclear disaster, the cause of which is no longer remembered, is called the Flame Deluge. Mutants resulting from the fallout, two-headed monsters, are called the Children of Fallout, Fallout being the demon who caused the Holocaust. At Leibowitz Monastery, the monks preserve records of the Golden Age that preceded the demon fallout. These are manuals of technology and bits of old blueprints which no longer mean anything but are held to be holy relics. The monks learn them by heart, make copies of them, and sell them to other monasteries. The church is riddled with superstition. The flame deluge has been written into scripture, and the cardinals at New Rome wrangle endlessly over the niceties of the Immaculate Conception. Church ritual is meaningless. Old bits of electronic equipment are strung together as holy necklaces, but nevertheless, this ritual serves to prevent knowledge from the past from going completely into oblivion. One day, a monk, on solitary vigil in the desert, is surprised by a ribald old tramp who shows him the entrance to a previously undiscovered fallout shelter. There, among the skeletons, the monk finds some charred paper, including a blueprint of a design signed by Leibowitz and another relic from the Golden Age, a manuscript entitled Racing Form. When he gets back to the monastery, the monks elaborate this story until the old wanderer becomes a reincarnation of the blessed Leibowitz himself, complete with halo, although the old tramp had in fact thrown stones at the monk for refusing to accept some of his bread and cheese. These priceless discoveries are sent to New Rome, and 2 papal commissions investigate the miracle of their survival and rediscovery, and the entitlement of the blessed Leibowitz to be sanctified. After spending 15 years making an illuminated copy of the blueprint, the monk who found it takes the original to the Pope, who kisses it and canonizes the long-dead electronics engineer, having received guidance from above for this step. On his return journey to his monastery, the monk is waylaid and eaten by 2 of the cannibal children of Fallout. The old wanderer appears again on the scene and buries what remains of the poor monk. 600 years pass. Mankind is still in a state of barbarism, and there are rumors of a major war. All the same, literacy is on the increase, and there is renewed interest in science and philosophy. Leibowitz Monastery still retains some of the ancient texts, but others have been destroyed in the forays of nomads and ignorant crusaders. The current abbot realizes that the old texts are incapable, of themselves, of reviving civilization, but he feels that they could assist emergent science. He allows them to be inspected by a team of scientists sent by one of the ruling princes. The abbot has misgivings, however. He knows that the ancient civilization had been destroyed by materialism. He fears that the new scientists will use any knowledge they get to destroy the church which preserved it. Then, free of the restraints which the church might have provided, they will proceed once again to destroy civilization. Science always washes its hands of blood, yet knowledge of science cannot be withheld till man is wise, or he would never merit it. Neither infinite power nor infinite wisdom is sufficient to bestow Godhead on man. There must be infinite love as well. One of the monks, working from the old manuscripts, actually produces electric light in the monastery from a crude hand-operated dynamo. The visiting scientific commission is amazed, because it was simply not possible to construct the device directly from the books. How did the monk's jump from theory to practice come about? Was this a miracle? Staying at the abbey is a poet fool who is irreverent about everything. He sees through science and religion alike. He writes scurrilous verse and has an artificial eye with which he claims he can see. After performing a self-sacrificing act, he is killed by a soldier. Is it possible that wisdom may reside in someone who is neither of church nor science? The old wanderer appears again. He claims to be the wandering Jew born before Christ. He tells the abbot that he feels and accepts the burden of the whole Jewish race. Could the abbot take upon himself the whole burden of Christendom? The burden of man is on every man, though a Christian was relieved of most of it by Christ. The abbot has a sudden recollection of the poet fool. He had not regarded it as a burden, but as ancestral glory, which he had inherited and which he held as his birthright. The Jew is still looking for the Messiah, but as he searches the faces of the scientists, he knows that he is not there. Another 6 centuries pass, and a generation of light succeeds the Dark Ages. Man has now colonized space, and another nuclear war is beginning. By this time, St. Leibowitz has become the patron saint of electricians, and some men revere Saint Poet of the mysterious eyeball. Still intact, the abbey is by now completely modernized. But the change is only in externals. Its old activities are still slavishly and meaninglessly continued. The abbot, working with a translation machine, muses that souls were first vegetative, then animal, then rational. Then instead of souls becoming angels, they became machines. The old Jew appears again, still looking for the Messiah. The abbot feels there is no hope of heaven for man. The human species has been born insane. The papacy is now planning to send a party of monks and bishops to colonize another planet. With them, they will take all the church's historic memorabilia, and from their base in space, they will try to evangelize other worlds. On Earth, the church has ceased to pray for peace. It pins its hopes on its message surviving elsewhere. Meanwhile, the radiation count is rising. Refugees pour into Leibowitz Monastery. Voluntary euthanasia is administered to the fatally irradiated by a secular medical unit. This so outrages the abbot that he breaks his vow of non-violence and has an unseemly brawl with a doctor in order to prevent the euthanasia of a mother and child. For the doctor, pain is the only evil, and society is the only lawful arbiter of right and wrong. To the abbot, the doctor is a murderer, depriving the woman of what she could gain by suffering and breaking God's laws. There is an explosion, the abbey is wrecked, and the abbot finds himself half crushed in the ruins. He now tries to prove for himself in practice that pain is not the evil, but fear of suffering is. Society, he sees, tries to increase security and minimize suffering. The result is minimal security and maximum suffering. The abbot tries to take on himself the suffering of others. A two-headed woman struggles up to the abbot. She wants him to administer baptism for her second head, which till now has been asleep. As it slowly awakes, the face reveals the features of infancy and innocence, the face of a being which is born free. Suddenly, the woman speaks with a new voice and refuses the abbot's baptism. Instead, she administers the sacrament to him. She acts with authority, as though under direct instruction, sensing the presence under the veils. In her eyes, the abbot sees the promise of resurrection. Has God, through all the ages, he wonders, manifested himself not in science, not in church, but in wholly unexpected places? In this astonishing story are contained insights into processes not normally suspected. Miller's points might be summarized thus. Established religion, in any age, perpetuates outworn dogmas, no longer understood, and no longer having any developmental value. Even this fossilized ritual can, nevertheless, be the vehicle through which knowledge is saved from oblivion. The devotees of religion are conditioned by both fears and promises of reward to carrying out the religion's moral precepts and to accepting personal suffering. This can lead people to goodness, to self-sacrifice, and to humility, but it cannot take them to the kingdom of heaven. During the dark ages which sometimes follow wars, learning is preserved in a church, though it may not be understood. Eventually, this knowledge leaks back to the outside world, and science is thereby enabled to begin again. Science, however, always develops in conflict with religion and is then used by temporal powers for materialistic ends. Since neither church nor science can change man's nature, the result must always be the destruction, with the aid of scientific knowledge, of the civilization that gained it. During this recurring and self-perpetuating process, the Spirit of God never deserts mankind. But it does not truly manifest either in the followers of religion or the followers of science. It is manifested in and transmitted by certain rare individuals whom the world considers least worthy. If fiction like Leibowitz and the message it contains is spin-off from a deliberately arranged contact with a possible future, the warning is very clear. If it were possible to see similar contact with a remote past and find a similar warning, the message would be doubly underscored. It will be remembered that Muhyiddin, the teacher of Andalusia, obtained information by direct perception from a discarnate entity beside the Black Stone at Mecca. It stated that although Adam was the father of the human race, 30 other worlds preceded him. The appearance of both the wandering Jew and the poet fool in fiction, written today and located in the future, suggests the endurance and vitality of the ideas which these figures embody. The wandering Jew legend appears superficially to be an essentially Christian idea, but it can be found, in some of its many forms, antedating the Christian era by many centuries. Even in its Christian form, the Jew is not always a Jew. In some legends, he is a Roman. He appears also as Malchus, who lost his ear to Simon Peter's sword. He has also been Judas, Athanasius, Melmoth, and Theudas. He is Zerib bar Elia, Elijah, and Michob Adar, the identity used by O. Henry in his famous tale. One of his names is Laquedian or Laquedem, which looks very like Lakodem, the ancient one, that is, humanity. The wandering Jew was a well-known idea in the East at the end of the first Christian millennium. Throughout Europe in the Middle Ages, and through the agency of Goethe, Shelley, Hans Christian Andersen, and modern writers like Viereck and Eldridge, has been appearing all over the world ever since. Even in some conjectured dark age of the future, he is to be seen pursuing his hopeless search in Leibowitz Abbey. If the activities of a school involve the implanting of certain concepts at selected times and places, always in a form acceptable to the time, we may suspect that the Wandering Jew is one such concept. Joseph Gare, in his Legend of the Wandering Jew, draws the elements of the legend together from many sources. Scriptural references led the Christians of the first millennium to believe that one of the signs of the second coming of Christ would be the appearance of the Antichrist. As AD 1000 approached, a number of irreverent opportunists appeared in Palestine and elsewhere, denying the Father and the Son, and claiming to be the Antichrist. They were generously prepared to accept from Christians the personal property they wanted to unload against the Day of Judgment. When AD 1000 came and went without the world ending, these various antichrists in the Near East became blurred into a composite memory. The Antichrist passed into the collective memory in the symbol of a man who could be tall, short, fat, lean, wealthy, poor, apostate, and devout all at the same time. When the First Crusade reached Jerusalem, the Antichrist had become the Wandering Jew and was chiefly identified with Malchus. The Crusaders returned home with a Wandering Jew corpus, the common denominator of which was a man who did not die, but who was doomed to wander till Judgment Day. 200 years later, the idea was greatly authenticated during an ecclesiastical conference in St. Albans Abbey. One of the delegates was the Archbishop of Armenia, whose talent as a spinner of yarns captivated the delegates. He claimed to have seen Noah's Ark perched on an Armenian mountain, and to have met Joseph Cartaphilus, the Wandering Jew. Joseph, who had been a porter in the hall of Pilate, had then been wandering for 12 centuries. He had spitefully chided Jesus to hurry on to his crucifixion. For this action, he had been cursed to wander the earth, tormented by remorse ever since. Joseph, the bishop told the St. Albans Conference, places his hope of salvation on the fact that he sinned through ignorance. This story was preserved in the records of St. Albans, and a surviving manuscript dates from 1250. The legend spread back from Britain to the continent, but the beloved of God, Cartaphilus, now came to be known as Butadeus, smiter of God, a remarkable example of a fundamental idea being represented by the play of opposites. The smiter of God suggests that the Jew is now identified with one of Pilate's officers, John 18:22-23, who struck Jesus for not being sufficiently servile to Pilate during the interrogation. The story gets a new impetus 300 years later. About 1510, a poor weaver in Bohemia called Cocotte finds a frail old man at his door late at night. He gives him shelter and learns that the old man, his eyes pools of sorrow, is the Wandering Jew. The old man reveals that he had once before called at this same house and had been received with similar hospitality by Cocotte's grandfather. He mentions a legend in Cocotte's family about treasure and reveals that it was he, the Wandering Jew, who helped Cocotte's grandfather to bury it. He shows Cocotte where to find it, and the latter, wild with excitement, runs up and down the street, showing all his neighbors his newfound gold. But when he gets back to the cottage, Joseph has disappeared. The story in this form has many significant elements reminiscent of Sufi teaching material. About 1550, the Wandering Jew turns up in the presence of Cornelius Agrippa, who is himself a figure representative of a secret tradition. Agrippa of Nettesheim is deeply religious, but is also reputed to be a magician. He has access to legendary treasures, but dies, 1535, in abject poverty. He has spent his life, like Paracelsus and the Wandering Jew himself, in wandering. In a patriarchal society, he is a feminist. Joseph persuaded Agrippa to exercise clairvoyance and show him, Emma Magic Mirror, scenes from his boyhood. The sight of a rabbi's daughter, whom Joseph had loved 1500 years ago, is too much for him, and the old Jew runs from Agrippa's house in renewed torment of soul. Still in the 16th century, the Wandering Jew appears to a Moslem general, Fadila, who is offering a prayer of thanksgiving in his tent after the Battle of Elvan. Fadila describes Joseph as looking like a very old dervish. The legend was collected a century ago by Sabine Baring Gould. The Wandering Jew tells Fadila that he is really the prophet Elijah, Zerib bar Elia, and gives Fadila an account of the external conditions which will immediately precede the second coming of Christ. Here the Jew is linked to a long pre-Christian Hebraic legend of the immortal prophet Elijah, who, like Arthur in our own era, was taken to be in the body till the end. In Mohammedan legend, Elijah is the same as Kidda, the mysterious green one who appears in the flesh at critical moments to guide and safeguard the worthy. In English chivalry, the Garter order is believed to have sprung from the Kidda order in the East. The Kidda is also identified in some European traditions with the Count of Saint-Germain, who is also immortal. 16th century German versions of the Wandering Jew legend say that the Old One eats and drinks practically nothing, a circumstance noted over and over again in European appearances of Saint-Germain. Thus, an ancient Hebraic tradition, Mohammedan law, the Arthurian idea, English chivalry, and the occultist father figure Germain appear to be variations and mutations of a single archetype. According to Fariduddin Attar, the Kidda or Kizza is the guardian of the source of the waters of immortality. And Sir Richard Burton, who was an initiated Sufi, says Kidda represents the completed Sufi. The Wandering Jew legend in Slavonic countries has a peculiar element. There, the Jew's wanderings involve him in a mission to preach and exemplify the brotherhood of man. He appears only to people at the point of greatest despair, or at the point of suicide. He convinces them of the need to live out their fate, whatever the cost. A very close affinity is to be seen between this aspect of the Wandering Jew and Sufic teaching material about the Kidda. Here is one example. It is taken from a compilation of legendary Sufic teaching stories. Kidda is the unseen guide of the Sufis, and it is he who is believed to be the anonymous guide to Moses in the Quran. This green one is often referred to as the Jew, and he has been equated in legend with such figures as St. George and Elijah. This tale, or report, is characteristic of the supernormal functions attributed to Kidda, both in folklore and among the dervish teachers. Once, while standing on the banks of the Oxus River, I saw a man fall in. Another man, in the clothes of a dervish, came running to help him, only to be dragged into the water himself. Suddenly, I saw a third man, dressed in a robe of shimmering, luminous green, hurl himself into the river. But as he struck the surface, his form seemed to change. He was no longer a man, but a log. The other two men managed to cling to this, and together they worked it towards the bank. Hardly able to believe what I was seeing, I followed at a distance, using the bushes that grew there as cover. The men drew themselves panting on the bank, the log floated away. I watched it until, out of sight of the others, it drifted to the side, and the green-robed man, soaked and sodden, dragged himself ashore. The water began to stream from him. Before I reached him, he was almost dry. I threw myself on the ground in front of him, crying, "You must be the Presence Kidda, the Green One, Master of the Saints. Bless me, for I would attain." I was afraid to touch his robe because it seemed to be of green fire. He said, "You have seen too much. Understand that I come from another world, and am, without their knowing it, protecting those who have service to perform. You may have been a disciple of Syed Imdadullah, but you are not mature enough to know what we are doing for the sake of God." When I looked up, he was gone, and all I could hear was a rushing sound in the air. After coming back from Khotan, I saw the same man. He was lying on a straw mattress in a rest house near Peshawar. I said to myself, if I was too raw the last time, this time I'll be mature. I took hold of his robe, which was a very common one, though under it I thought I saw something glow green. "You may be Kidda," I said to him, "but I have to know how an apparently ordinary man like you performs these wonders. And why? Explain your craft to me, so that I can practice it too." He laughed. "You're impetuous, my friend. The last time you were too headstrong, and now you're still too headstrong. Go on, tell everyone you meet that you've seen Kidda Elias. They'll put you in the madhouse, and the more you protest you're right, the more heavily they'll chain you." Then he took out a small stone. I stared at it, and found myself paralyzed, turned to stone, until he had picked up his saddlebags and walked away. When I tell this story, people either laugh or, thinking me a storyteller, give me presents. The Wandering Jew and Kidda may be regarded as opposite sides of the same coin. Both have prototype origins in early race memories. On one side of the coin is Cain, who was cursed for his sin and obliged to wander forever. Strangely enough, some medieval legends say the wandering Jew carries a curse mark on his forehead. Cain, Cartaphilus, is the composite symbol of man, condemned to a certain kind of immortality, connected with recurrence. His fate is the consequence of his sin. On the other side of the coin is Enoch/Elijah/Kedar. This is the composite symbol of the man who has won true immortality. His fate is the reward for his merits. In rabbinical tradition, Enoch's arrival in heaven is associated with a cosmic storm. Elijah, who did not taste of death, went up by a whirlwind to heaven. In medieval Europe, the appearance of the wandering Jew was accompanied by terrifying storms. Rabbinical traditions assert that after his translation in the flesh to heavenly state, Elijah remains in touch with the earth and visits those in extremity of distress to comfort them. Here there would seem to be a clear overlap with Kedar legends. The Jewish encyclopedia is quite explicit. Elijah the prophet became the prototype of the wandering Jew. Rabbinical tradition does not, however, have only one wandering Jew. It has 36, and these 36 are only the earthly counterparts of a heavenly band of the same number. Yet the 36 figures of rabbinical legend are never seen separately, but appear on earth as a single figure. This would seem to be a variation of the Muslim concept of the Abdals already mentioned. The astonishing vitality of the wandering Jew idea is shown by the fact that it has found a new vehicle within the last century and a half: the Mormon religion. According to Mormon ideas, a righteous man named Lehi emigrated with his family from the Middle East to South America around 600 BC. Some of his descendants, the Lamanites, were the ancestors of the Red Indians. Others, the Nephites, gave rise to the righteous white races. After the crucifixion, Jesus appeared in South America to the Nephites, 3 of whom were chosen to receive special spiritual gifts with the words, "And ye shall never endure the pain of death, but when I come in my glory, ye shall be changed in the twinkling of an eye, from mortality to immortality." Like the wandering Jew, the 3 Nephites have been reported all through American history ever since. Also, like the rabbinical legend of the wandering Jew, the 3 Nephites never appear separately, but always as a single individual. This individual is an old white-haired man, dressed in ancient clothes. Joseph Smith, to whom Mormons believe the Book of Mormon was revealed, may have known of the wandering Jew legend. Certainly many of his German and English converts at Utah must have done. We have looked at many strange figures and some even stranger stories. Some appear to refer to the same idea, others to an entirely opposite idea. Could they be obverse and reverse of a single concept? Could this have been implanted deliberately in the human subconscious? It seems that when cultures rise and fall, their arts and their literatures do likewise. But there is something which has a higher factor of survival. Fables outlive fact. Legends penetrate where logic perishes. Folklore, myth, and legend transcend the fluctuations of the historical process. It is as though a myth carries such a penetrating energy that it can leap the gap between cultures, a carrier wave that unites the ceaseless and separate generations. If there are those whose psychology is superhuman and whose present moment spans many generations of men, it seems likely that they will employ a medium with a comparable timescale. Perhaps they use myth to make the mankind child feel what he does not yet understand, or to recall what he once knew. The Jew/Kedar/Enoch/Elijah composite, for all its seeming diversification, carries an integral subconscious content. Myth personifies abstract ideas. The wandering Jew is the personification of mankind. Once upon a time he sinned. Though he sinned in ignorance, he sinned willfully. As a result, he is cursed. He is condemned to make repeated appearances on the temporal scene, searching for a means to undo the past. The Jew is not one man, but many. He is thin, fat, short, tall, devout, and irreverent. He is mankind. In this corporate sense, he is immortal. The Messiah personifies the concept of redemption. The wandering Jew is searching for the Messiah, for redemption which is a means of altering the past. He does not understand that while he searches for it, on his own terms he can never find it. Enoch/Elijah/Kidder/Jermaine personify the man who has found what the wandering Jew is looking for. He is not condemned to immortality against his will. He has been rewarded with the immortality he has earned, and he uses it to help the evolutionary process on the earth. Yet in a sense, his immortality too is corporate, for he also is one in many. Yet the many, the rabbinical 36, the Mohammedan Abdals, and the multiple Nephites appear and act as one. The monks of Leibowitz Monastery superstitiously preserve documents they do not understand because of some subconscious imperative. One day, miraculously, they produce light. Humanity cherishes the myths it does not understand. One day, perhaps,